Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this special GEMS Graduate of the EMS 125th Anniversary Virtual Education Series event. I'm Sanjay Srinivasan, the department head of the John and Billy Leone Family Department of Energy and Mineral Engineering. Today's webinar, like the others in this series, are designed to engage and educate students, alumni, and various other stakeholders on exciting developments in the college. This event is sponsored by the Events Committee of the GEMS Board of Directors and supplements the GEMS annual Fall Showcase that is normally held on campus. The webinar series will continue through 2021 and beyond. A little bit about our department. Energy and Mineral Engineering is a unique department at Penn State with an integrative focus on energy and earth resources. The diversity of expertise in the department and value placed on interdisciplinary scholarship enables EME to play a special role in integration across traditionally disparate fields. And we are in the business of addressing major technological and social challenges related to sustainable energy and the use of Earth's resources. We conduct innovative, forward-looking research across the life cycle of energy systems, technologies, economics, and policy. Our faculty, researchers, and students value engagement with the public and private sectors to improve science-based decision-making. I'm excited to report that the department recently worked on the strategic plan for the next 5 years, taking input from alumni and various other stakeholder groups, developing our strength in sustainable energy systems, science and engineering, building on our decades-long legacy to be at the forefront of petroleum systems, science and engineering, facilitating a global energy and technology transition in an economically and environmentally sustainable way through mining and environmental systems and engineering, science and engineering. These are the essential elements of our strategic plan. We recognize that society's use of energy resources is entering a major transition period that will see our current and future graduates experiencing tremendous change throughout their careers. EME needs to position its scholarship and educational efforts to be in a leadership position in decisions and design of next generation energy systems. And some insights into this very important challenge is the topic of our webinar today. I would now like to introduce our moderator for today's talk, Joe Franz, before yielding the floor to him. Joe graduated in 1981 with a BS in Petroleum and Natural Gas Engineering from Pennsylvania State University. He recently retired from Range Resources Corporation, where he served on several roles, including as the VP of Engineering and responsible for the production and reservoir engineering departments. Joe serves on the board of the United Way of Washington County, the GEMS board at Penn State, and recently completed his board role for the Society of Petroleum Engineers as a regional director. He's working part-time with Deep Well Services and ResFrac as a senior executive advisor. Also excited to report that Joe recently opened France and Associates to perform executive level consulting for the oil and gas industry. So take it away, Joe.
Thanks, Sanjay. And I'd like to welcome everybody in our audience of alumni, faculty, and students. We had over 200 registered today, so that is fantastic. And I think we're excited today, and I want to welcome Seth Blumsack in, who will be our presenter. Seth is a professor of energy policy and economics and international affairs in the Energy and Mineral Engineering Department. He's also the director of Center for Energy Law and Policy. And I think you'll find this talk very exciting today. It's on energy and transition. And we will talk about the energy supply and demand in the US and what changes might occur as new climate change policies are rolled out at the state and federal level. So at the end of Seth's talk, I'd encourage those with questions to type into the Q&A box, and we'll feed Seth a series of questions for a while. So without further ado, let's start the presentation, and I'll turn it over to Seth.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Sanjay. And thank you to the GEMS board for inviting me to do this. I'm excited to have this conversation today. And it is just a terribly exciting time to be an energy person at Penn State. So Let me get all set up here. All right. So I'm going to start with kind of the big picture here. So the US is a major energy user, right? We use 100 quadrillion BTUs of energy every single year, more or less, to run our entire economy, right? And this is a huge amount of energy, right? So 100 quadrillion BTU, that's like enough for me to drive my car around the equator hundreds of millions of times, right? And so it's such a big number, it's hard to get a handle on. But we can use pictures like this to give us a sense of how all of these different energy resources kind of flow through the economy. So this is a picture called a Sankey diagram, and it starts over on the left with all of the different energy resources that our economy uses, you know, your coal, oil, natural gas, wind, solar, and then it traces the paths of all of these energy resources kind of through the energy economy of the United States. And so the most important thing to get out of this picture for our discussion today, and there's a lot of things to get out of pictures like this. The most important thing is that our energy economy kind of exists in two worlds, right? So we use a lot of different fuels for electricity generation, right? So you see natural gas, coal, wind, solar, and so forth. A lot of those go into the electricity generation box, and then that electricity powers homes, office buildings, and things like that. And then on the other side, you know, our industrial energy, to some degree, is really driven by oil and gas, and our transportation economy runs almost entirely on oil, right? So we don't use oil to generate electricity. And we basically don't really use very much other than oil to run cars, buses, planes, ships, and so forth. Right? And so these are kind of the two worlds that our energy system basically currently lives in. Now, along with using all of that energy, right, there's some environmental footprint. So because of our energy use, there are emissions of various things into the air, into the water, right? And some of these are more localized pollutants like oxides of sulfur and nitrogen, particulate matter, right? And others are climate changing greenhouse gases. And so the picture here shows you kind of the contribution of different sectors of the US economy to total greenhouse gas emissions over roughly a 30-year period, right? And so for decades, the electricity sector was really kind of the leader in terms of the environmental footprint associated with our energy economy's energy use, right? And so, you know, if you just look in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, for a long time, electric power was, you know, had a larger footprint than cars and buses and planes. It had a larger footprint than industry, right? And so power plants, right, were for a long time the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions and major contributors to other pollution issues, right? And so because of the kind of outsized role of electricity in the environmental footprint of energy generation, and also because, you know, there are like 100 million times fewer coal-fired power plants than there are cars in the US, a lot of regulatory focus in terms of reducing the environmental footprint of energy we're really focused on electricity, right? Now, on the right side of this picture, one of the things you'll notice is that for the past few years, electricity has not been the kind of top contributor to U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, right? And so, kind of the days of the electricity sector kind of being this focus of environmental regulation and reducing environmental footprint are starting to end, right? Because we have shifted over the past several years from generating a lot of electricity from coal to generating it with natural gas. And because of the very rapid rise of renewable power generation, we're now at the point where, at least for greenhouse gases, transportation, industry, and in some states, even agriculture are bigger contributors to climate change than electricity is. And so, sort of amazingly, this shift has happened without any kind of coherent federal regulatory approach to climate change, right? And so driven by an increased awareness of the impacts of electricity generation on the environment and on global climate, and also facilitated by falling costs for renewable energy technologies that plummeted much faster than anybody expected. The demand for cleaner electricity has kind of really been taken up by states. And you can see the picture on the left shows a lot of different states have different sorts of clean electricity mandates, and also by cities, right, which is the picture on the right. So states and cities are starting to demand cleaner electricity, and utility customers are also demanding cleaner electricity, right? And so the picture on the left shows a number of utilities that have adopted their own internal low or zero carbon electricity targets, in part prodded on by actions of their states. And the picture on the right shows the growing market for renewable electricity deals that are being signed by large businesses in the US. And so kind of this idea that we could have a near zero carbon power grid, or even totally zero carbon power grid within the next 2 or 3 decades, is no longer a laughable idea, right? This is a transition that is happening now, and it is happening in some places exceptionally fast, much faster than we thought that it could. And so added to this, right, as parts of the United States are adding lots of wind and solar onto their grids, right, grid operators are figuring out how to absorb this massive amount of renewable energy in ways that have not really affected energy costs, and in most cases have not affected the reliability of the grid, right? And over the past 2 days, I'm sure the grid operator in Texas has learned that maybe it'll pay to de-ice wind turbines, sort of like we de-ice airplanes, right? And so as we've seen in Texas over the past couple of days, the technology challenge for renewables integration into the grid has not been totally solved yet, right? There's still a ways to go, and there's still work to be done. But the national power grid as a whole is moving very, very fast to being able to absorb very large amounts of wind and solar onto the power grid. And so kind of the success story of renewables adoption in the grid has really kind of uncovered this kind of uncomfortable truth about dealing with energy's environmental footprint, and especially decarbonization, right? We spent a really long time thinking really hard about how to decarbonize the power grid, and maybe a little bit less time about how to decarbonize transportation or other sectors of the economy. And really, these efforts kind of existed in 2 different worlds, right? And so we thought about these things totally separately. We spent a lot of time focused on decarbonization of the power grid, which actually, in part because of all of our efforts, turns out to have been much less difficult than we had originally thought it would be, right? And the harder parts are turning out to be reducing the environmental footprint of fuels outside of the grid. So decarbonizing transportation, industry, and some forms of building energy use. Okay, and this is a fundamentally more difficult problem, because unlike in electricity, where we can use existing infrastructure and where we just need to push wind and solar and various forms of energy storage and other things kind of down the cost curve and onto the grid, with transportation, industry, and other sectors, we really aren't sure exactly what the future looks like, right? And with some foresight, we can certainly electrify a lot of things, especially things like transportation and a lot of forms of building energy. But industry, in a lot of cases, is going to be more difficult. If you think about things like steel, cement, right? It's not clear how you make those things all electric. I spent a lot of time studying the power grid, and so I'm a big proponent of electrifying everything possible. But I think the reality is that in some areas, we're probably going to need to substitute various kinds of low carbon fuels for traditional fossil fuels in order to push transportation and industrial energy use down that decarbonization curve, right? And so, right now, there's a lot of interest in hydrogen, right? A lot of increased interest in hydrogen because you can produce it using natural gas, you can produce it using clean electricity, right? And we can store it relatively easily. But we really don't know exactly how this is all going to play out over the next, few decades, right? What we do know is that it's, in addition to it being a very exciting time, is that if we are really serious about taking the efforts that we have put into decarbonizing and cleaning up electricity and moving those to other sectors of the economy, it's time to roll up our sleeves and get to work. There's a lot to do, but there's an incredible amount of opportunity here, right? And just to think about it, solar panels are something like $1 trillion market over the next 20 years, and that's going to be what? At most a third of the US energy economy, at most. So the energy world is changing very rapidly, right? It's like the Wild West out there, and it's likely to be that way for the coming decades. And so to continue to lead, not just in research and technology development, but also in education, Penn State and EMS are frankly going to have to change the way that we think about educating energy students, right? And Sanjay alluded to this during his introduction. When I arrived at Penn State 15 years ago, basically every student, when they graduated, or at least most of the students that I interacted with, 2 weeks after graduation, got in their car and drove to Houston, right? And we used to have these conversations with students about whether they were more interested in oil and gas or more interested in careers in electricity. And that suited the interests of students in the energy economy at the time. But it's probably not the best model for this rapidly changing world. And I'm increasingly finding that this is not how students look at their career prospects. So sort of as geeky as it sounds, right, what is the future of energy education, right? And as geeky as it sounds, a lot of the future in energy careers is basically thinking about systems, right? How different pieces of the energy world fit together, right? And how skills from one traditional energy sector could be portable to other energy sectors, right? And so, what we are going to have to teach our students is not just those fundamental skills, but also kind of breadth of knowledge so that they can adapt, right, to this rapidly changing technology market and, frankly, social and ethical landscape, right? And so what we are thinking about now is how do we train people to be successful in the Wild West energy world, right? And what we think is we make them problem solvers, not just engineering experts, right? It's for students at all levels, right? Which includes people who are professionals who want to come back and get some additional education. What we need to do is we need to give them tools, right? That's clear. We need to give them a real world sense of kind of how institutions work and how they're changing. And we need to give them a global perspective. And all of that stuff we think will add up to success. And so EMS, I'm very fortunate to be in EMS at this particular time because we have this kind of very unique capability to think in these interdisciplinary and unconventional ways and make this kind of pivot. And so now, along with those who are energy professionals, it is our turn to roll up our sleeves and get to work on the future of energy. So thank you very much, and I would be happy to take questions.
All right, Seth, fantastic job. We appreciate your time in putting this detail together, and hopefully the audience was able to learn a few new things. We have a few questions, and Sanjay, we might put the first one towards you, if you can unmute yourself there, or have Colleen. Thank you. So the first question comes in from an anonymous. He says, I don't understand why PSU still supports the oil and gas industry. And so I'll throw that one out there to you, Sanjay.
Yeah, thank you for that question. As Seth alluded to in his presentation, I mean, there is a massive transition that's occurring in the energy sector, but natural gas does figure very prominently in that transition, and most likely will be in the picture for the next couple of decades or so. And so I think it's important to engage with the oil and gas companies, come up with technologies that are environmentally sustainable, even with natural gas production, this hydrogen conversion, storage of hydrogen in subsurface formation. All these are issues that oil and gas companies and industry can really help us solve some of those important challenges.
Thanks, Sanjay.
Can I add something to that, Joe?
Absolutely.
I think my own view of the world is that there's also value to engaging with folks in the oil and gas sector, because a lot of these companies, especially larger companies, are in various ways, right? And they all have different strategies, but in various ways are going to wind up looking more like diversified, integrated energy companies in the future, right? The idea that BP or Shell or whomever is just to be an oil and gas company in 30 years, I don't think that's in line with anybody's view of, kind of how the world is changing right now. And so I think as these companies become more diversified, there's a tremendous opportunity, right, for us to work with them to help them understand technologies, understand business decisions, right? And, and also, frankly, to give some folks who are, who have spent some or most of their careers on the oil and gas side, some exposure to technologies and systems that they may not be familiar with. I've had a lot of conversations with students who are very, very passionate about clean energy. And one of the somewhat counterintuitive pieces of career advice that I give them is that it's not a bad idea to, if the opportunity arises, to go work for a large oil and gas company for a few years after graduation. Even if it's not what you want to do for the rest of your life, there is a tremendous amount that you can learn from working in these organizations because of how complex they are and because of just how active they are in bringing new technologies to market. And so there are all sorts of lessons that can be ported from the oil and gas space to other parts of the energy world. And as a professor who is not doing this stuff on a day-to-day basis, understanding how this technological innovation happens, right, by engaging with traditional energy sectors is really instructive.
Yeah, and I'll say from my perspective, working with very large and very small oil and gas companies, as well as service providers, the business processes they have in place are just fantastic. And their ability to get things done in a quick way and very cost effectively, I think will translate and help the renewable sector as those two industries start to merge together in the largest companies anyway. And I'll throw out too, is when I was with Range Resources, we were in Washington County, we had no power source, yet we needed power. So at one point, I think we were one of the largest purchasers of solar panels in Pennsylvania. So there's solar panels at all of our well sites throughout, in Washington and back in the day, Greene County and Beaver County. So, there's a symbiosis there, I think, that people don't realize is important. And so I'll throw out another question to you, Seth. This is from one of our GEMS board members, Kevin Kai. Can you comment on GM's recent announcement of going full EV by 2035? How will this impact the demand on the electricity power grid? So comment on GM's recent announcement of going full EV by 2035.
Yeah, that was certainly a monumental thing, right? For GM to say, um, assuming for the moment that that they're actually able to live up to that they're able to live up to this commitment, and by 2035, one of the biggest auto manufacturers in the US and in the world, right, is no longer producing vehicles with internal combustion engines. And it's not, I'll say it's not just GM, right? There are, other vehicle manufacturers, maybe in not quite as splashy, in sort of splashy terms, are also making major pivots towards electric vehicles. I know that, Toyota, for example, sees, hydrogen or other kinds of fuel cells as a very viable kind of vehicle energy source, right, in the future, right? So they're investing there. The I mean, this is a very, very big shift, right? And it's one that if you had asked me 5 years ago, I might have said, oh, it'll take 50, 60 years to do this. And if large manufacturers are starting to get their supply chains in place for this transition now, it could happen much more quickly. And there are obvious implications for the electricity grid, right? Both potentially, both potentially threats and also opportunities, right? So first of all, from the perspective of utilities, right? Utilities love this, right? Because one of the other things that's been going on is that the demand for electricity in the United States has basically been stagnant for some time, if not falling, right? So we have increasingly energy efficient appliances, homes, buildings, all sorts of stuff like that. And so from the utility perspective, meeting electric vehicle load, that's kind of the next big market. It's certainly something that utilities and grid operators are going to have to plan for, right? And I think utilities, the situation that we often talk about, which is the situation where everybody on the East Coast plugs their car into charge at 6 p.m. all at the same time and brings down the grid. Utilities and grid operators already understand this scenario, and they, along with a whole just host of really innovative startup companies, are finding ways to avoid problems like this, right? So kind of the idea of kind of smart coordination of vehicle charging is one that utilities started to take seriously over 5 years ago, right? And so I don't necessarily think that's the kind of threat to the grid that we think it is, right? But at the same time, utilities are going to have to start to plan and adapt to this growth in new electricity demand, and they're probably going to have to adapt perhaps a little more quickly than they might have expected.
We have a lot of good questions coming your way, Seth, so we'll get through these as best we can. But one that I think is relevant to your electricity background was submitted by Sean Merdzek. And he said, do you think we'll ever have a power grid that is 95+% renewables, or will there always be a role, albeit a small one, for oil and gas and electric generation?
Well, okay, so will we ever have a power grid that is 95% renewables?
Correct.
I think the answer is absolutely. And part of the reason I say absolutely is that you have to remember that renewables are not just wind and solar, but also include things like hydro, right, biomass power plants, and which those have not been a huge player in the U.S. electricity grid. In some areas of the country, even geothermal. So do I think we will get 95% wind, solar, and nothing else? That I don't think so, right? You're going to need some kind of balancing resource, whether it is hydroelectric or battery energy storage or kind of smart electricity demand that can, adjust along with fluctuations in wind and solar. And I think the reality is that we are going to have a lot of different portfolios of these things. In terms of that last 5%, that last 5% is a genuine challenge. My own belief is that for probably at least the next 2 or 3 decades, there will be some kind of traditional resources in the power grid. So whether it is diesel backups, natural gas, something that involves kind of dispatchable power and fuel that's easily stored, right? And this may wind up being a mix of natural gas and hydrogen, right? And because utilities are, at least many utilities that I have interacted with are increasingly interested in hydrogen, right, as a substitute for kind of conventional fuels, right? Because it gives them that controllability that they're looking for, but at the same time, the hydrogen fuel, through various different means, can be produced with a much lower environmental footprint than using conventional hydrocarbon fuels.
Thanks, Seth. Another one of our board members, Spacecraft, as we like to call him, he had a great question of, how do you see grid operators adapting their business models to accommodate residential and industrial solar injection into their grid? And you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but clearly it's a up and down type of a supply that was into a system that was pretty much a constant demand. So that's a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So far, it has been with what I might, in many cases, describe as a great amount of fear and trepidation, right? So, and utilities, honestly, they're in a very difficult position, right? Because they have this regulatory mandate to keep up the grid for anybody who wants to use it, okay? And they have to figure out how to pay for it and how to spread those costs around. But at the same time, in some areas, especially in places like California, there are an increasing number of their customers who are finding alternatives to the utility, right? And we're not talking about people who go totally off the grid, right? We're talking about people who put solar panels on their houses, whether they have battery backups or not, right? And use the grid differently, right? And it's not necessarily that they're using it more or using it less, because some of them are using it just as much as they used to before the solar panels, but using it different, right? And so there's a couple of very fundamental changes that I think need to happen. One is that we are going to need to totally rethink the way that we price electricity. For decades and decades and decades, we priced electricity volumetrically, right? So for every kilowatt hour you use, you pay 8 cents or 10 cents or 12 cents or whatever it is that you pay in your state. And increasingly, in order for the utility to maintain that mission of providing the grid for everybody to use, we're going to have to think about paying for the grid like we pay for kind of other very different kinds of infrastructure, where you're basically paying for using the capacity of the network, right? So this is how we all pay for cell phone service right now, right? And so one thing is that we're really going to have to rethink the way that electricity is priced. The other thing is that utilities are in a difficult position, but part of the reason they're in a difficult position is that they have this very close relationship with their regulators, right? And so at the same time that it's incumbent upon utilities to rethink their practices and not necessarily view what we call distributed energy as a threat, it's also incumbent on utility regulators to allow utilities to experiment with new technologies, right, with different kinds of structures to pay for the grid, right, and to do it in a way where it is okay to fail, right? It's okay for a technology not to work out, right? And that's very different than almost the entire, industrial history of the electricity sector, right? And so I think both of those things are going to have to change.
Thanks, Seth. Great answers. So we had a couple supply questions and longer term questions come up. So I'll start one with Kenneth Kupchak. Is there a sufficient supply source of lithium, cobalt, et cetera, necessary for the batteries? And are there toxicity issues with their disposal?
So good. That's a very good question. So supply issues. Globally, is there enough lithium? Probably. The supply issue with lithium, at least as I understand it, is not necessarily whether there's enough lithium globally to manage the energy transition, right? But the questions are how, is ramping up the supply chain for lithium going to be a constraint, right? Is it going to be a constraint or a bottleneck to facilitating more, more variable renewable energy on the grid, or facilitating more electric vehicles? I mean, I think that's a question. The other issue with lithium and also with cobalt and kind of some other materials that are going to be key but probably underappreciated facilitators of the broader energy transition is not whether there's enough in some global sense, but kind of what the geographic or global distribution of production looks like. And so, right now, most of the lithium and a number of other materials that we need come from other countries. And it's not that we can't produce this stuff here, it's that for various reasons, we don't really produce this stuff here. And so, whether you're talking about, finding environmentally and socially acceptable ways to increase domestic supplies, of these materials, either through new mining operations or through recycling or capturing these materials from various kinds of industrial waste streams, right? So, just as an example, there's really interesting potential to capture all sorts of critical materials from the waste that has been left over from the coal extraction industry in Pennsylvania and other states, right? And so, thinking about some of these maybe less conventional sources of materials supply is, I think, kind of a critical piece of kind of broader change in energy systems, so that we don't go back to where our energy system was in the 1970s, where we were kind of totally dependent on foreign sources for critical energy.
So at a higher level, you talked about decarbonization and what that might look like. Question from John Leese: what would your ideal coalition for solving decarbonization in the various sectors, what would that look like in terms of the expertise involved, alliances, government representation?
Oh, that is a great question. So I think in terms of in terms of a coalition, I think that if we take decarbonization really seriously, okay, this coalition will include not only the folks that you might think of, like engineers, business people, technology innovators, utility regulators at all sorts of different levels and all this kind of stuff. I think if we're serious about this, I think there is a tremendous amount of expertise in the oil and gas sector that needs to be captured, both to help us learn how to move unconventional fuels around, like hydrogen or whatever. And also, I'm one of these people that believes that if we are really serious about decarbonization, and I mean really serious, then we need to take carbon capture and sequestration very seriously. And I think that that subsurface knowledge, right, that kind of subsurface reservoir engineering knowledge, I think that collective expertise in oil and gas can provide that very well. And I think also, another thing we're going to have to take very seriously is offshore energy, right? And offshore wind, floating solar, all sorts of things like that. And, these are environments that the oil and gas sector has been pretty experienced working in, right, for decades. So there's a lot of, there's a lot to be harnessed there. The other thing I would add to this is that there, in the US is different than a lot of other countries in that we do not have an explicit construct of like a social license to operate. But I think over the past few years, there has been much more serious attention paid to issues of equity, justice, governance, all of those sorts of things. And one of my great fears is that we will be so entranced by all sorts of cool new technology that we won't spend any time figuring out how to bring those sorts of concerns into technology development at the very beginning, as opposed to plowing forth with new cool technology and then trying to figure out how to deal with these social issues at the tail end, right? And so I think that is going to require a much more fundamental rethinking of the way that we do energy system planning, technology market rollout, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the transitions rarely happen quickly or peacefully. If you look at the various fuels that we've had during the last thousands of years, most of them took a while till we got from one to another. So we're just in the middle of that right now. And appreciate your insight on it, Seth. And we'll go to a little different slant on this. And some of this is about the environment. Some of this is about cost. So I'll read you three questions that kind of all tied together, and you get the big picture of what I think these three folks are after. So how do we educate the public about how the environmental cost, or what is the environmental cost of green energy? You're mining for rare earth metals and issues related to green energy waste, and so on. Can you comment on the environmental costs of building large chemical battery storage, and if there is any other path to go down with renewables other than storing excess energy in batteries? And finally, how will the increased demand for the raw material and minerals for the solar cells and batteries have an effect on the environment? So questions related to cost and the ultimate environment, the life cycle type thing that we don't hear a lot about with the batteries and windmills.
Yep. So I guess I'm going to start by saying that if we continue to genuinely care about and value a highly reliable power grid, right, in the next 100 years, the way that we have in the last 100 years, then we are going to have to figure out ways to achieve large-scale energy storage using a lot of different technologies to provide, fast response energy storage, long duration energy storage, all this different kind of stuff in ways that are ultimately environmentally acceptable. And this is not to say that we are gonna magically wave our hands and make the trade-offs go away, right? We're not, right? All of our energy use has some environmental consequence. And so again, assuming we want to maintain kind of that same level of performance out of our energy systems, then we are going to have to find a way to manufacture, transport, utilize, recycle chemical batteries of all kinds, in ways that are not just environmentally acceptable, but also minimize risks to health and safety. I think also we are also going to need to revisit and maybe think a little unconventionally about about some technologies that have honestly the past couple decades been kind of old school, right? So I think we are going to need to think creatively about hydropower again, right? Which means going back to issues around around alteration of river ecosystems, impacts on fish and other aquatic species and things like that. And so I don't want, none of us should be kidding ourselves that that we can have this kind of magical green energy future without any environmental impact, right? And I think this connects actually back to the question about sources of supply, right? Because a lot right now, I mean, a lot of our supplies of certain materials are coming from countries that frankly don't have the kinds of environmental standards that we do, right? And so so this is another argument for trying to find ways to innovate and to make more domestic production of these materials economically competitive.
Well, I appreciate your honest answer there, Seth. I mean, it's something we all have to balance, as always, and there's no easy answers. So I appreciate you saying that. There's a bunch of questions related to different types of other technologies. Some exist, some don't. So I'll throw these out there. I appreciate the various audience members who have given these questions, but I'm because of the timing and the more questions coming in, I'm going to lump these together. But so what's the future of things like the nuclear industry, geothermal, maybe deep drilling with geothermal, a green diesel product, or direct capture of carbon out of the air? So that's a lot to throw at you, but nuclear, geothermal, green diesel products, and direct capture of carbon out of the air.
So I'm gonna actually, this may sound a little odd, I'm gonna lump nuclear and geothermal together. Because I think both of these potential energy sources can have a future if we think about using them in different ways than we have historically. So geothermal and conventional geothermal in particular is one that's very location dependent, and enhanced geothermal sort of still has a ways to come down its own cost curve. But for both of these technologies, kind of the model that I think we have in our heads of how these technologies are used, like we're going to build a giant nuclear power plant, or we're going to basically drill a big geothermal field. I think that's not really where, in my view, the biggest potential for these technologies are. I think nuclear and geothermal are really intriguing possibilities for providing both electricity and useful heat to remote areas. So in places like Alaska or something like that. I think nuclear nuclear and maybe to a little lesser extent geothermal, I think have very intriguing, almost like very like kind of futuristic potential in replacing fossil fuels for kind of industrial heat and steam applications, kind of very high temperature, sorts of applications. For both nuclear and geothermal to basically to do these things, they both don't just have economic problems to solve, but they both have public relations problems to solve, right? The kind of the public perception of nuclear technology, I think, is pretty well known, right? Especially if you're in this state and were alive when 3 Mile Island happened. And there have been some some incidents involving induced seismicity and different kinds of geothermal applications. And part of the challenge with those technologies is to kind of move past those models in people's heads of how they're used and where the potential impacts might be. So, and as for, as for green diesel, I think my own view is that in large part, kind of the writing is on the wall with kind of light duty vehicles. That manufacturers are very interested in EVs. They're very interested in fuel cells. Like things like biofuels, whether it's ethanol or diesel or anything like that. They may still be out there for certain applications, but I just don't see the big vehicle manufacturers configuring their supply chains for that kind of future right now, right? And I may be totally wrong, right? Again, who knows what the next 20 years will bring?
How about direct capture out of the air?
Oh yes, direct capture out of the air. Again, this is one of those things that sounds totally and completely nuts. But again, if you think, if you take really deep decarbonization, right, and meeting very ambitious kind of, global temperature change, carbon concentration targets seriously, I think it's something that you have to consider, and along with other like other technologies that we kind of group under this umbrella of geoengineering, direct atmospheric modification, all this kinds of stuff. I think even if we never deploy anything, I think it is in the world's interest to figure out some kind of international regulatory framework for this, because because what you don't want to have happen is for one country or one actor to unilaterally engage in some kind of large-scale planetary modification, right, for whatever reason.
And I've heard some people say, if we all just planted more trees, that would help in some way, right? So
there's certainly a lot of potential for terrestrial carbon capture, right? I mean, even in a relatively small state like Pennsylvania, if we expanded the forested lands, that would soak up a lot of CO2.
Absolutely. So I'll lump a couple other questions here together. This one is really intriguing to me, and I don't completely understand it, but it's more on the electric side where your expertise is. So wouldn't decentralized energy also be a way forward to supplement the regional power production to achieve the stability? And then a follow-up, when are we going to switch to a 220 volt grid?
The first one, I don't know. We'll have to see how many, how fast electric vehicles are adopted, because I think a lot of those require, I think it's 220 amps. But so I mean, as to the first question, the promise of distributed resources, right, in not just sucking demand away from utilities, but also being able to enhance the stability, reliability, and resilience of the grid. So first of all, this is something that is happening now. If you look at, after Hurricane Sandy, for example, in this part of the country, there were cases where solar panels, batteries, combined heat and power installations basically, allowed, some amount of electric services to be provided in some locations while the grid was being repaired, right? So I think there's a potentially underappreciated but increasingly appreciated value of these kind of behind the grid kinds of resources, not to run the entire grid, right, but to allow individual customers or groups of customers to continue receiving services when the power goes out. There's also a lot that these kind of behind the grid devices can do to help ride through to help ride through fluctuations in wind and solar, right? And places like Texas and California that have both had kind of very high profile reliability incidents, right, related to kind of a failure to plan appropriately for renewables. Both of these states are places where they have actually utilized these distributed resources, and the demand side of the grid actually very effectively, right? So, one of the reasons that we don't have more of these stories in Texas is because the utilities and the grid operator in Texas have actually been pretty sophisticated about integrating the demand side, right? And being able to, in some imperceptible ways, adjust demand to match fluctuating supply. And lots of other utilities are starting to experiment with these kinds of smart electricity systems.
And I think the temperature issues across the country are showing some of the potential drawbacks, very short term for hours or days in some of our systems. Through the years, it was tough getting natural gas to some places when everybody's cranking up their furnace in wintertime. And so the ice storm will show people here's maybe a different solution. But we're kind of running out of time here, so I'll throw two other quick questions out to you. Tom Conto said, what research would you recommend on the trade-off between burning fossil fuels for ICE-based autos versus burning fossil fuels for electricity production for EVs?
So this is basically the smokestack to tailpipe shift. Basically, to me, this is a relatively straightforward answer, in that internal combustion engines are for the most part not terribly efficient, right? And there are ways to make them more efficient, but the ways that we make them more efficient sort of run headlong into the kinds of things that people tend to demand from their cars, right? Like 0 to 60 in less than 120 seconds. So one of the great promises, I think, from, that comes with vehicle electrification is not just the potential to reduce the use of fossil fuels in transportation, but even if this shift happens tomorrow, right, and we just shift from using oil in cars to using coal and natural gas and other things for electric vehicles, a lot of these power plants basically even after you consider the inefficiency of the power plant and the energy losses on the transmission system, are still more overall energy efficient than internal combustion engines. But at the same time, I think that that vehicle manufacturers are clearly taking electric vehicles very seriously. What we don't necessarily know is under what circumstances different types of consumers are going to take them equally seriously, right? And so there are issues related to not just performance, but also things like charge time, vehicle range, all sorts of things like that.
Sure, affordability.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, the whole car industry seems to be headed down this path. I haven't heard too much about the trucks, and that is a lot of fuel being burned as we transport materials around the world, let alone in our boats and things like that. So. But I think we need to wrap it up. This has been a great session. Seth, you did a good job. Thanks, Sanjay, for the lead-in. A lot of good detailed material. We'll have this presentation out on the EMS website. And I want to thank to all those that attended and that those that ask questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to answer all the questions. I was trying to lump several of them together. And I hope you learned something today, as always. And we'll be doing more of these presentations. We're trying to do them every 2 months. I believe the next one will be on sustainability initiative within the College of Earth and Mineral Sciences. And so stay tuned for some emails and information about that. Then finally, we'll have a survey that we would like to put out to the group, a quick survey to give us your feedback and give us your ideas for future talks, because we have a great list of professors and initiatives within EMS right now, and we're trying to go through each department and let them showcase what's going on. So with that, I'll say goodbye, and thank you for joining in, and we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.